Welcome to Global Studies 9.
The Byzantine Empire, Chapter 11, Section 1. So we left off at the end of Quarter 2, where Rome had fell, where Western Rome had been taken over by the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, various Germanic tribes, and the Gauls, and all that's left is the eastern part of Rome. Now it gets a little bit tricky in regards to what we call this territory, because even though it's technically eastern part of the Roman Empire, they call themselves the Byzantine Empire, and they're very different from the Rome we looked at with Caesar and Octavian and whatnot. So how it differs is that they had different languages, they had different religions, and even though there was a small period of time where there were emperors that ruled from Rome over the east side, for the most part of history, the eastern part of Rome, or what we know as the Byzantine Empire, was ruled by emperors that considered themselves separate from Rome that had fell in the 5th century. Now, if we put them next to each other and create a nice little Venn diagram here, there'll be some similarities. For example, they're similar Senate systems. They both had gladiators. The laws were relatively similar, but there were some glaring differences. For example, when it comes to religion, Rome was pagan, right? Whereas Byzantine Empire, the main religion there was Christianity. When it came to language, in Byzantine they spoke Greek, whereas in the Roman Empire Latin was the primary language there. And finally, we have big differences like what they stood for. The Roman Empire was this colossal, ginormous, huge empire that would expanded all across Europe and Northern Africa, and they were always on the offense, right? They were always expanding, except for the last few hundred years, but they were constantly expanding and constantly at war. Whereas if we look at the history of the Byzantine Empire, they generally are on the defense all throughout history. And in fact, if you look at the way their empire changes, it just shrinks every century, all the way until the 15th century, when finally all you have left is Constantinople, its capital, which eventually falls as well. So when it comes to emperors, we're going to later look at Theodosius just a little bit, but primarily we're focusing on Constantine I and Justinian. And when it comes to Constantine, he's a brutal ruler, but he was also very skilled, well known for being a great commander in the military and able to shut down various barbarian attacks onto the Byzantine Empire. But he's probably most well known for his conversion to Christianity, which eventually has a major impact because Christianity becomes the primary religion officially when Theodosius takes over just a little bit after him, makes it mandatory for all those who live in Byzantine Empire to become Christian. Now, the story of Constantine and his conversion is still very controversial among historians in regards to why he did this. So back then, Christianity was persecuted 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, but then slowly began to gain popularity, and when he converted, he was already in his 40s. So therefore, some historians are a bit questionable when it comes to his motives in regards to why he converted. Was this a political maneuver, or was he genuinely believing that he wants to convert? Well, if it was genuine, the story goes as the following. There was a famous battle at the Milvian Bridge. And this battle here was dreamt upon by Constantine. And he, in that dream, saw a holy cross. And he was convinced that Christianity was the one to help him win this battle. So Constantine, at this battle of the Milvian Bridge, was absolutely convinced that he saw a holy cross, and that holy cross helped him win this battle at the Milvian Bridge. And since then, he converted to Christianity.
Final note on Constantine is his effect on Constantinople. So this is a map portraying Constantinople, and perhaps the most interesting thing about the city under his rule is these grand walls that he built, very simply named Wall of Constantine. They surround the city, including the waters and land, and these walls prove to be very important later on when those who live in Constantinople must fend off potential invaders. When Constantine the Great passes away in 337, land is passed on to his three sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans Very mouthful there to remember. And the three of them actually go to war with each other. Constantine II is murdered. Constans is then murdered by a commander from the Gaul army, and that leaves us only with Constantius II. For a while, the empire is crippled from the civil war, and it's not until a good century and a half later, when Justinian comes around, that Byzantine sort of has its second renaissance. So Justinian I, despite coming from very humble backgrounds, ends up becoming the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. And his rule is really not just himself, but with him and his wife Theodora, together they help rebuild the Byzantine Empire. Now nicknamed the Emperor Who Never Sleeps, Justinian was involved with military expansion. He was involved with rewriting the laws, also known as the Justinian Code, or Codex Justinianus. One of Justinian's greatest accomplishments was building the Hagia Sophia, which still exists today. If you fly to Istanbul, you can check it out. It's a beautiful building. I've been there before myself. As you can see, it's a very unique building in the sense that at different points in history, it's served as a mosque. It's also served as a church. So you see various religious symbols all in the same building. A truly unique sight for one to see. Under Justinian, there are several conquests, and empire peaks by the time Justinian passes away in 565 AD. As you can see, the Byzantine Empire is quite big in size. Now, the Justinian Code, also known as the Codex Justinianus, was a translation of these various laws in Latin into Greek. An interesting point about these laws is that it also included a set of rules where Christianity was now enforced. So in fact, in a matter of 300-400 years, Christianity went from a religion where people were being persecuted to now to a point where if someone's not Christian, they're being punished. So it's amazing how much can change in a matter of a few centuries. And the legacy of the Justinian Code is very similar to Roman law itself prior to the Byzantine Empire. A lot of these codes were later on utilized by various Western civilizations such as the United Kingdom and the United States of America. Now, the love story between Theodora and Justinian I is truly unique. Theodora also comes from very humble backgrounds. In fact, she was an exotic dancer prior to meeting Emperor Justinian. And later on, the marriage between the two would prove to be one of the best decisions Justinian made. For example, when there were the Nika riots that were trying to overthrow Justinian as emperor, Justinian was considering escaping the city, but it was his wife who helped convince him to stay and to bring down the riots and continue on as ruler. It's a very romantic love story in the sense that after Theodora passes away, Justinian never remarries, despite having all the power and money one could have. And he continued to remain single until he died himself, and he was buried right next to his wife. Now, unlike the western part of Rome that was ravaged by the Huns, the Byzantine Empire managed to fend off Attila and the Huns through paying them off and buying them out. True, this meant the Byzantine Empire was now poor with less gold, but it also meant they didn't have to worry about their empire being conquered by outside invaders. Now, the East-West Schism is a very important event which occurs in the latter years of the Byzantine Empire. So one of the reasons why the schism occurs in the first place is the disagreement in regards to some key parts of one's lifestyle. And one of the major issues was celibacy, whether or not the priests can get married. So on the Roman side, people believe that no, marriage should not be allowed, whereas on the Eastern side, people believe that marriage is okay. This resulted in a split within the church, and we have this very unusual event where there's mutual excommunication. So there's a pope in the East and there's a pope in the West, and they both say, you guys are not really Christians, and they kick each other out from the church. And what's very interesting is this divide continues on for centuries and centuries and centuries, and it's not until just a mere half a century ago where the two sides, the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox Christians, actually revoke their excommunications from the 11th century. So another interesting point about religion during the Byzantine Empire was this Iconoclasm dispute. So there were two periods of this Iconoclasm dispute where originally portraying deities in the Christian faith was discouraged, especially in the early years, but around the 5th, 6th, 7th century, we started to see more and more use of people showing images of Christian deities like Jesus Christ. So this created some pushback, and Emperor Leo at the time, he banned the use of any type of imagery of holy deities. And as a result, as you can see in the picture here, people would purposely get rid of images of, for example, Jesus Christ in protest. We had the East that was firmly against the use of images, and we had the West that was saying, no, we will use images if we want. Now, it's interesting how this issue that happened about 1,000 years ago is still very relevant today, but through a different religion. In this case, we're talking about Islam. So a very important case to know is the case that occurred in Paris in the early mid-2000s, where there was a publishing company called Charlie Hebdo who had published images of Muhammad, and in retaliation, Muslim extremist groups went in and killed several of the people who work at Charlie Hebdo. So in a sense, iconoclasm is still a disputed issue today, especially when it comes to the portrayal of the Muslim deity of, or the Muslim prophet in this case, of Muhammad. Very interesting in the sense that we've covered concepts and ideas, for example, like Socrates and the freedom of speech and censorship. And here you even see me, myself, as you can see on the bottom half of this slide, I have censored myself. I put a little blue square over the original image of Muhammad in fears of basically my own security. I don't want to put pictures of Muhammad up and risk my own personal security. So it's very interesting when it comes to this concept of censorship. Although the Byzantine Empire saw a brief revival under Justinian I, it continues to shrink in size. Eventually, each century it loses more and more territories from very aggressive invasions coming from the east of them by Arab Muslims, and eventually, once the Muslims go on to dominate the Mediterranean Sea, which as we know is a very important body of water for trade, the Byzantine Empire shrinks in size and power and influence, and eventually by the 1400s, the empire eventually completely crumbles. In 1453, Mehmed the Conqueror comes in and literally destroys the walls, those great walls once built by Emperor Constantine, and defeats the Byzantine Empire and absorbs it as part of the great and powerful Ottoman Empire that would go on to exist all the way into the 20th century. So although when it comes to censorship of religious deities, people often think of Islam, it's not limited just to Islam, as this commercial here shown in Australia in 2017 is portraying Ganesh, a Hindu god. It's actually caused some backlash in India, and it goes on to show that the concept of what you can show and you can't show, especially in the realms of religion, is still a very sensitive issue, and there is really no clear-cut definition in regards to what is okay and what is not okay when it comes to what images one can portray. Here's the copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Have an excellent day. Goodbye.
I'm talking about the